The Kremlin once boasted of being the world's energy superpower. At the peak of this pride stood two giants, Gazprom and Rosneft. Gazprom employed approximately 490,000 people, while Rosneft employed approximately 350,000. These two companies were among the largest employers in Russia and provided livelihoods for millions of people. However, today these giants are mired in a deep quagmire that has made Putin the subject of international ridicule. The biggest proof of this is that Gazprom, once the Kremlin's geopolitical weapon that shook Europe, has declared bankruptcy by announcing a record loss of $7 billion for the first time in 22 years. But this is not just the collapse of a company's balance sheet. It is the bankruptcy of the oligarchs, mass panic on the home front, and a superpower devouring itself in its death throes. Now, massive factories are closing, unions are sounding the alarm, and millions of people are facing unemployment and hunger. Cities like Surgut in Siberia, the heart of Gazprom, or the refinery towns in the Urals. For the millions of people living in these cities, Gazprom or Rosneft was not just an employer, but life itself. Now that these facilities are beginning to downsize or close, these cities are turning into ghost towns. There is nowhere else for the unemployed to go. Simultaneously with this economic earthquake, Russia's industrial heart was ablaze along a 1,000-kilometer line stretching from Siberia to St. Petersburg, from Crimea to the Urals. Because this did not happen by itself. It was the most ruthless and systematic logistical strangulation operation in history. By October 2025, Ukraine's long-range drones had reduced exactly 38 key refineries, the lifeblood of Russia's oil empire, to ashes. 40% of total production capacity was irreversibly destroyed. Gazprom's $7 billion embarrassment was only the first bill for this 40% physical destruction. And what would follow this shock would be much worse for Putin and the regime. Because the massive losses announced by Russian railways, Rosneft and Gazprom were fueling opposition to Putin among the millions of workers employed by these giant corporations, and even among the oligarchs who own them. Now, energy giants like Rosneft, which we have analyzed to have lost 40% of its production capacity, are following in the footsteps of RZD. Although official figures are censored by the Kremlin, information leaked by independent Russian economists and local news sources within Russia reveals the chaos within these giant companies. According to sources, these giant companies are either directly laying off hundreds of thousands of employees or condemning them to months of uncertainty under the guise of unpaid leave in order to stay afloat. Now, given Gazprom's record losses and Rosneft's 40% drop in production capacity, some Western economic analysis organizations estimate that at least 20 to 30% of the total workforce at these two companies, or 250,000 to 350,000 people, are at risk of losing their jobs directly or being placed on indefinite unpaid leave. First, we must look at the basis of this chaos and panic that is fueling the turn of millions of workers loyal to Putin against him and the regime. That is, this was a surgical operation targeting the war wallets financing the war. These oligarchs had somehow managed to evade Western sanctions since the beginning of the war, shifting their fortunes to Dubai or Hong Kong. But now they were forced to helplessly watch as the source of their wealth, their physical infrastructure, was reduced to ashes. This meant that the war launched by the Kremlin was now devouring the fortunes of the Kremlin's closest allies. At the top of the list is Igor Sechin, Russia's most feared Silovik figure, CEO of Rosneft, and known as Putin's shadow cardinal. Rosneft, Sechin's state-owned empire, was the company that paid the heaviest price in these attacks. The Tuapse refinery was Sechin's most profitable export gateway on the Black Sea. That gateway is now permanently closed. The Ryazan and Samara refineries were Rosneft's main arteries feeding the Russian domestic market. Those arteries have been severed. Second, Vagit Alekperov's legacy, the private oil giant Lukoil, was shaken by the bombing of its massive facilities in Volgograd and Nizhny Novgorod. Third, Leonid Mikhelson, owner of Russia's largest private gas company Novatek, was crippled by the bombing of the key Ust-Luga terminal on the Baltic coast. These attacks directly cost these individuals and the companies they run billions of dollars in losses. This is the system eating itself. Putin's war was now consuming the fortunes of those financing it. At this point, The helplessness displayed by these powerful oligarchs reveals the regime's fragility and the deep fissure within it. But what about Putin's own creations, Sechin and Miller, whose fortunes are entirely indebted to the state and to Putin? Their response is a sign of much deeper panic: silence. Igor Sechin's panic is rooted in a technical nightmare. According to reports by Western energy analysts speaking to agencies such as Reuters and Bloomberg, Rosneft does not have the Western technology and spare parts needed to repair the damaged AVT units. This is no secret. It is an industrial reality. Sechin is trying to patch up these facilities with Chinese or domestically produced replacement parts, but this permanently reduces production capacity and increases costs astronomically. Sechin sees his empire melting away before his eyes, but he cannot go to the Kremlin and say, "Stop the war," because he knows that the moment he says that, he will be branded weak and unpatriotic, and he will lose both his fortune and his life. For this is his trap. The same helplessness applies to Gazprom CEO Miller, who is on the verge of bankruptcy with a $7 billion loss. Miller's disgrace was sealed by his beggar visits to Beijing. After losing Europe, his begging China for the Power of Siberia II agreement showed how Moscow has been humiliated internationally. These oligarchs clearly see that the fortunes they have accumulated over decades and the empires they have built are being sacrificed to finance Putin's military quagmire in Ukraine. Deripaska's public outcry, Sechin's silent technical panic, and Miller's humiliation on the international stage. All of this is proof of why the elite are secretly looking for escape routes, trying to move their money to Dubai or Hong Kong, and protecting themselves against the regime's ultimate collapse. The oligarchs' silent panic and the refinery disaster that hit Russia's oil industry, a 40% loss of capacity, inevitably led to a chain reaction that spilled onto the streets and directly impacted the lives of ordinary Russian citizens. The collapse of the internal front was no longer a theoretical risk, but a reality unfolding before our eyes. And, as always, it was those at the bottom who paid the highest price for this collapse. Putin's stability in return for obedience contract was torn up. In order to survive, the regime began to sacrifice its own people, effectively starving them. The most concrete evidence of this execution was mass layoffs and unpaid leave. This is a ruthless method Russia resorts to during economic crises. As documented by Reuters, the state-owned Russian Railways, RZD, abruptly left hundreds of thousands of employees, some estimates say 700,000 people, effectively unemployed under the guise of part-time work or unpaid leave. This was a move to prevent the company's collapse, but ordinary workers paid the price. Now, as of October 2025, we see history repeating itself, but on a much larger scale. Energy giants like Gazprom, which reported a $7 billion loss, and Rosneft, which we analyzed to have lost 40% of its production capacity, are following in RZD's footsteps. Although official figures are censored by the Kremlin, according to information leaked by independent Russian economists and local news sources within Russia, these giant companies are either directly laying off hundreds of thousands of employees or condemning them to months of uncertainty under the guise of unpaid leave in order to stay afloat. Let's put the numbers into perspective. According to pre-war data, Gazprom employed approximately 490,000 people, while Rosneft employed approximately 350,000. These two companies were among the largest employers in Russia and the livelihood of millions of people. Now, considering Gazprom's record losses and Rosneft's 40% drop in production capacity, some Western economic analysis organizations estimate that at least 20 to 30% of the total workforce at these two companies, or 250,000 to 350,000 people, are at risk of losing their jobs directly or being placed on indefinite, unpaid leave. These figures may only be the beginning and are bound to increase as the crisis deepens. Salaries cannot be paid. Social rights are being suspended. This is not just an economic measure, it is a social massacre. The most devastating impact of this massacre is felt in the monogorods scattered across Russia, i.e., the single industry towns, where all economic and social life is dependent on a single factory or facility. Cities like Surgut in Siberia, the heart of Gazprom, or the refinery towns in the Urals. For millions of people living in these cities, Gazprom or Rosneft was not just an employer, but life itself. Now that these facilities are shrinking or closing, these cities are turning into ghost towns. There is nowhere else for the unemployed to go. This is effectively condemning millions of people to starvation. Local telegram channels and reports from some brave independent journalists show worrying signs of rising crime rates, alcoholism, and despair in these regions. Although large-scale protests have not yet been reflected in the public sphere due to the Kremlin's tight control, some local sources and OSINT analyses point to small-scale, local protests and walkouts in some Ural and Siberian refinery towns, for example, in the Orenburg and Samara regions. Unpaid wages or mass layoff announcements. Although such incidents are usually quickly suppressed by Rosgvardia, National Guard, they should be interpreted as a sign of growing anger and despair. Small groups gathering in front of factories, while not yet turning into a mass uprising, demonstrate how the regime's social base is being shaken. And all this economic devastation is spilling onto the streets. The fuel crisis is now chronic. After 38 refineries were hit, the mass fuel shortage that began across the country continues. Miles-long gas lines, black markets, and rising prices are fueling civil panic and anger toward the regime. The freezing crisis is at the door. A tragedy similar to the one that occurred in Podolsk in January 2024, where a primary school classroom froze over, is bound to happen much more widely this winter. Putin's contract has evaporated in those gas queues and bled dry in unpaid salaries. There is no plan B. It's a vortex. The people are now victims not only of the war, but of their own state. This collapse did not happen overnight. Its foundations were laid over many years. And the biggest mistake was actually the arrogance of the Kremlin and Putin. He believed Russia could defend its vast territory while at war. However, modern warfare tactics could reach even the most remote corners unseen. This arrogance was perhaps Ukraine's greatest opportunity and advantage for a long and systematic dismantling. The Kremlin's strategic arrogance dealt its first and most deadly blow to Gazprom, once the undisputed symbol of Russia's global power. Gazprom was never just an energy company. It was an unofficial foreign ministry conducting the Kremlin's foreign policy. It was a massive financial weapon that held European capitals hostage, financed political deals, interfered in elections, and fed the Siloviki system built on corruption. Putin's energy superpower strategy rested entirely on the shoulders of this giant. However, in the fall of 2022, the Kremlin decided to turn this weapon on itself. By shutting off the gas flow to Europe as a means of blackmail, in order to punish Europe for its support of Ukraine, it was actually signing its own financial suicide note. This was one of the greatest strategic miscalculations of the 21st century. The Kremlin believed that Europe's dependence on Russian gas was absolute, chronic, and irreplaceable. They were sorely mistaken. Europe, through a strategy that was initially painful and costly but implemented with determination, broke away from Russian gas by building LNG, liquefied natural gas, terminals in record time, turning to alternative suppliers such as Norway, Qatar, the US, and Azerbaijan, and increasing energy efficiency. The collapse in numbers is the anatomy of a disaster. Before the war, approximately 45% of the European Union's gas imports came from Russia. Today, according to data verified by Western analysis firms and the International Energy Agency, IEA, this figure has fallen below 15%, and ironically, most of this residual flow still has to pass through Ukraine via pipeline remnants or LNG shipments that have not been subject to sanctions. This means billions of dollars in highly profitable revenue evaporated overnight. The most concrete symbol of this strategic suicide lies at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. The multi-billion-dollar Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, once intended to connect Germany to Russia and politically isolate Eastern Europe by removing Ukraine from the transit equation, are now rusting, useless monuments in the cold depths of the Baltic Sea, following the mysterious sabotage in 2022. These pipelines are not just piles of steel, but also the gravestones of Putin's dream of conquering Europe with energy. Gazprom has irrevocably lost its most profitable market, the high-paying, stable, predictable, and massive European market. The Kremlin's Plan B, the much-touted pivot to Asia strategy, has been a painful failure. Moscow hoped to compensate for the massive volume it lost in Europe by selling to the rapidly growing Chinese market. At the heart of this hope was the massive pipeline project called Power of Siberia 2. However, this plan collided with Beijing's ruthless economic realism and strategic patience. China knew how desperate Moscow was, that it had lost the European market and had nowhere else to sell this massive volume of gas. Therefore, Beijing humiliated the Kremlin by constantly stalling Moscow, deliberately delaying the agreement, and most importantly, demanding a humiliating price for this gas, far below European prices and close to Russia's domestic market cost. While announcing a record loss of $7 billion at the beginning of 2024, Gazprom CEO Alexei Miller was also forced to go to Beijing like a beggar and practically beg Chinese leader Xi Jinping for the Power of Siberia 2 agreement. These talks, documented by sources such as the Financial Times, clearly showed how Miller was discredited internationally and how Russia fell into the position of China's energy vassal. The result is a historic loss of $7 billion, or 629 billion rubles, 22 years later. Gazprom is no longer a superpower, but a wreck, drowning in debt, having lost its most profitable assets and sacrificed for a political fantasy. Gazprom's bankruptcy made the Kremlin's last major source of income, namely crude oil and, more importantly, refined petroleum products, the only solution for continuing the war. Financing the war machine, closing the budget deficit, paying salaries, and maintaining social stability on the home front depended entirely on this second lifeline. Ukraine's military strategists understood this equation much better than Moscow. If Gazprom's collapse was strategic suicide, the collapse of the oil refineries would be a systematic strangulation operation. Kiev realized that Russia's vast geography, spread across 11 time zones, was also its greatest military weakness. Russian air defense systems such as Pantsir and S-400 were designed to protect the front line or symbolic high-value targets such as Moscow. It was impossible for them to protect hundreds of civilian industrial infrastructures thousands of kilometers deep. Instead of expensive and limited ballistic missiles, Ukraine developed fleets of kamikaze drones that were cheap, easy to mass-produce, equipped with AI-powered autonomous navigation capabilities, and capable of reaching ranges of over 1,000 kilometers. The genius of this drone strategy was not to strike targets superficially. The goal was not just to cause a temporary fire in a storage tank, but to destroy the brain and heart of the Russian oil industry. Technically, the targets were the most complex, most expensive, and most difficult parts of the refineries to replace: the AVT, or atmospheric vacuum distillation units. These massive towers perform the primary distillation process that separates crude oil into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and other valuable products. Without these units, a refinery is merely a petroleum storage facility. It has no added value. Most importantly, the vast majority of these AVT units had been built or modernized using Western technology during the post-Soviet era. Due to sanctions, it was impossible for Russia to import or domestically produce these complex compressors, valves, and digital control systems. Therefore, every drone strike on an AVT unit meant not just a temporary shutdown, but a strategic blow leading to months of repairs or even permanent capacity loss. This was Russia's irreparable, high-tech Achilles heel. The scale of the destruction, as of October 2025, points to a logistical apocalypse, according to data verified by open-source intelligence analysts and Western military observers. A total of 38 key Russian oil refineries were successfully hit, many of them multiple times. These attacks completely destroyed 21% of Russia's total refinery capacity and approximately 40% of its critical petroleum product production. These attacks were not random. They followed a systematic three-phase strategic pattern. The first target was to cripple Russia's export capabilities and foreign exchange earnings. The first official sign of collapse came in March 2024, while the first wave of attacks was still ongoing. The Russian government was forced to make a sudden and panicked decision to ban gasoline exports for 6 months in order to halt the sharp rise in domestic gasoline prices and the emerging regional shortage. This was an embarrassing display of helplessness for a country that claimed to be an energy superpower. This ban was only a temporary band-aid. It couldn't stop the real bleeding. As Ukrainian drones continued to strike Tuapse, Ryazan, St. Petersburg, and Orenburg, the bleeding intensified. By the fall of 2025, when 38 key refineries were out of commission and 40% of capacity was gone, the band-aid came off completely and a full-blown domestic fuel shortage erupted. Gasoline lines stretching for miles from Vladivostok in Russia's Far East to Novosibirsk, the heart of Siberia, and then to Moscow's suburbs, ignited civilian panic. This was not just a matter of individuals being unable to find fuel for their vehicles. This was the collapse of the entire civilian infrastructure. As a result, the Kremlin's fairy tale of an invincible Russian economy has come to an end in the silent anger of people waiting in endless gas lines, in the breath of children shivering in their freezing homes, and in the empty balance sheet of Gazprom, which reported a $7 billion loss. Reports from international analysis organizations such as the World Bank and Stratfor confirm that this collapse is irreversible. Russia's projected growth rate for 2026 is 0.8%. This is not statistical stagnation, it is economic death. The ultimate shame is that the once feared energy superpower, with 38 refineries reduced to ashes and 40% of its production capacity destroyed, is now discussing importing gasoline from abroad, likely Belarus or Kazakhstan, to feed its own heart, Moscow. For the empire has devoured itself and perished. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.